This is the audio description. The video contains interviews with a number of experts connected with Women's Rights National Historical Park. Their names and titles will be read out in the audio description. The video includes historic images of suffragists at meetings, protests, and marches from the late 1800s through present day. There are also images of historical figures important in women's rights history. Additional description follows. Cultural landscape at Women's Rights National Historical Park, Seneca Falls, New York. Suffrage parade in New York City, 1912.
The 19th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution is going to be exactly 100 years old in 2020.
Kentucky governor signing the Anthony Amendment, 1920, surrounded by many women wearing sashes that read "Votes for Women."
And what's important is there's this 72-year revolution.
Timeline of women's suffrage movement including 1848, demand of elected franchise, first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York. 1869, Wyoming becomes the first state to grant women the right to vote. 1872, Susan B. Anthony votes illegally in the presidential election. 1890, Elizabeth Cady Stanton becomes president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. 1920, ratification of the 19th Amendment, granting all women the right to vote.
From the demand of elective franchise in Seneca Falls, Wesleyan Chapel, arcing over to the ratification of the 19th Amendment. That's a very interesting social movement. It's called the world's greatest bloodless revolution.
Suffragists stand on the steps of the U.S. Capitol in 1914. Speaker identified on screen as Colleen Jenkins, great-great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Women's Rights National Historical Park is in Seneca Falls, New York. It's on the Erie Canal, or near the Erie Canal, which was the main artery from the east to the west.
Image of Seneca Falls, New York, a small town on the edge of the canal. Map of the Erie Canal corridor across New York State. Zooms in on Seneca Falls, located just off the Erie Canal on the Cayuga-Seneca Canal.
You're along a major trade route with the Erie Canal.
Speaker identified on screen as Andy Decoder, Acting Superintendent, Women's Rights National Historical Park, followed by an image of suffragists in 1920 holding a sign that reads, "No self-respecting woman should wish or work for the success of a party that ignores her sex." Susan B. Anthony, 1872 and 1849.
You have abolitionists, you have Frederick Douglass, you have Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. All these people are traveling in the same networks, and they're coming together in this place at this particular time.
Historic map of Seneca Falls, New York. Next interview accompanied by a map of the towns of Waterloo and Seneca Falls along the canal.
Women's Rights National Historical Park includes 4 important sites. 2 sites are in Waterloo, including the home of Mary Ann McClintock, where the convention was planned and the Declaration of Sentiments was drafted, and the home of Jane Hunt, another leader in the women's rights movement. The other 2 sites are in Seneca Falls to the east along the canal. They are the Wesleyan Chapel, where the first women's rights convention was held in 1848, and the home of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which she referred to as the center of the rebellion.
Next interview is accompanied by images of a political cartoon mocking women from 1849 and a woman holding a protest sign surrounded by men in New York City in 1914.
This was a hotbed of radical activism in the mid-19th century. There were a number of women activists and men activists as well in the women's rights movement. The 5 organizers who are credited for bringing the Seneca Falls Convention together are Elizabeth Cady Stanton,
Historic images of the women mentioned.
Mary Ann McClintock, Jane Hunt, Martha Coffin Wright, and Lucretia Coffin Mott. The convention was first discussed as a possibility at the home of Jane Hunt.
Historic image of a 2-story brick home identified as Jane Hunt's house in 1903 fades into present-day image of the same location.
She was gathering friends for, we call it a tea party. It was a group of women who came together as friends and began talking.
Women standing in front of the White House in 1917, holding a banner that reads, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?"
About the injustices that they had experienced, that they witnessed, and they said, wouldn't it be incredible if we did what we as abolitionists have been doing for the anti-slavery movement, had a convention.
Historic newspaper clipping announcing the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York.
To talk about women's rights. So this is in Waterloo on July 9th of 1848. And from there, the women would meet at the McClintock House just a few days before the convention was held.
Historic sketch of the McClintock House fades into present-day image of the same location. Images from inside the McClintock House, including a historic desk with a letter, ink, and quill.
So on July 16th, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Marianne and Elizabeth McClintock, there may have been others as well, we don't know for sure, but we know that the three of them sat down and drafted the document in Waterloo, New York, called the Declaration of Sentiments.
Declarations of Sentiments from the Women's Rights Convention, with a list of all the women and men who signed the document.
And sentiments at that time meant that they were listing the grievances that they had about the ways that women were treated unequally.
Declaration of Sentiments Monument.
The Declaration of Sentiments was modeled on the Declaration of Independence,
Declaration of Independence,
which is a brilliant strategy to take something the nation accepted in 1776 and say all men are created equal, and then we need to add two words, all men and women are created equal.
Suffragists in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1915 stand below a banner that reads, "We demand an amendment to the U.S. Constitution enfranchising women."
The convention would move over to Seneca Falls. It would be held in the Wesleyan Methodist Church in downtown Seneca Falls, New York.
Map of Waterloo and Seneca Falls with a line starting at the McClintock House and moving to the Wesleyan Chapel. Fades into present-day image of the Wesleyan Chapel.
They assembled and read the Declaration of Sentiments and then called for a vote.
Drawing of the first Women's Rights Convention in 1848.
So it's just amazing to be in that space.
Present-day park ranger program in the Wesleyan Chapel.
It's really a hollowed space, and you can feel it when you walk in there. And
Speaker identified on screen as Nathan Richardson, Frederick Douglass living history performer.
And I've been in there numbers of times when I come up here for the convention days.
A large gathering of people inside Wesleyan Chapel.
And everybody, it's a palpable thing that everybody feels.
Whiteboard, where members of the public have written answers to the question, what is one thing you can do to support a cause you believe in? People have written, speak up, speak truth, fight the patriarchy, teach future generations to care for the environment, and other responses.
At the Elizabeth Cady Stanton House, you get a full view of who she was as a woman.
Stanton House circa 1900s fades into current day footage of the same location.
How she kept her house, the story of how she raised her children while she was doing all these other things.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton holding a baby.
The times that I have been there and sit on the porch and talk to people.
Nathan dressed up as Frederick Douglass, sitting on the porch of the Stanton House, surrounded by visitors.
You get the full sense of the full woman of Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
A park ranger stands outside the Stanton House while visitors explore the grounds.
I do think that the quest for women's rights is an ongoing process. On the second floor of our visitor center, we leave visitors with one last question, which is,
Women stands in Park Visitor Center reading panels about women's rights.
what will it be like when men and women are truly equal?
The rest of this interview is accompanied by images of civil rights protests over time, including New York City in 1970, ERA protest in Springfield, Illinois in 1976, marches across the country from 2017 and 2020.
And there are some who will leave notes behind stating, well, we've already achieved equality. We achieved that with the 19th Amendment. There are others who feel differently. But I do think that right now in our society, we are continuing to see the ripple effects of the women's rights movement today, and that we continue to recognize that there are areas where women do not receive equal consideration with men.
Women hold a banner reading, Indigenous peoples exist, resist, rise.
It doesn't mean that, okay, we have the right to vote, that's it. You know, we can end the party. I mean, women still have a ways to go as far as equal rights in America.
Banner from protest in 2020 which reads, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest." Speaker identified on screen as Nadia Sharam, Esquire, author of Declaration of Equalities for Muslim Women.
Women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and alike, they work very hard to gain many rights that women did not have in 1843.
Headquarters for the National Association opposed to women's suffrage in Washington, D.C. circa 1913.
And as hard as it is to gain those rights, it could be taken away from us much faster.
Women marching in New York City in 1915.
We need to preserve the history.
Ranger points to a monument for the Declaration of Sentiments surrounded by a school group.
And yes, it is relevant today because our daughters, our granddaughters,
Group of women and children holding signs at a protest in 2017.
they have to know the origin, they have to know the history in order for us to gain more rights, not to let go of those rights.
A girl holds a sign saying, "Never give up."
Everybody should know about Seneca Falls because this is where it all began. Women's rights, human rights.
Special thanks to Andy Decoder, Colleen Jenkins, Nathan Richardson, and Nadia Sharam. Director, cinematographer, and editor, Vanessa Hartzucker. Producer, Jennifer Hanna. Editor and audio describer, Christy Rugg. Music, Mirrors by Will Van de Kramer. Footage credits, American Antiquarian Society, Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division, Michael Owens Photography, National Women's Party, research assistance by Claylee Felding and Anna Taberzi, Seneca Falls Historical Society, Syracuse New Times, Women's Rights National Historical Park Archives. Visit the links in the description below to learn about women's rights. Olmsted Center of Landscape Preservation logo. National Park Service logo. National Park Service, U.S. Department of the Interior.